Hello, very beautiful community. I'll speak to you from the chair today because I've oxygenated myself in the hyperbaric chamber. Let's talk about Assad being gone. Now, in our culture, we tend to be very bad, especially when we're very online, to keep two things in mind at the same time. And what we've got to keep in mind is that an inconceivably brutal tyrant backed by an unlovely set of global quasi-alliances has gone, but that the future is very dangerous and very worrisome and uncertain for Syria. So keeping these two things in mind shouldn't be hard, but it is hard for us. So it's a moment of celebration and a moment of anxiety. An extraordinary moment, which a lot of people didn't get to see because of the extraordinary brutality of that regime, right? So we think of all the people who aren't here to see this, and we think of Western supporters of Syria and Western folks who worked there, like the remarkable journalist Marie Colvin, who lost her life in 2012. We think of everybody who isn't here to see this. There are people, coming out of prisons who don't know what year it is, don't know who is in power and where. People are scrambling in parts of the country to figure out what's going on. They're even asking Westerners, outsiders, to give them a sense of that. So a moment of peril that has the positive and the negative dimension. Here is another very important thing that we've got to talk about. You are currently surrounded by Western culture war discourse about what has just happened in Syria. And the fall of Assad is not a Western culture war event, it's a real event. We have a tendency to talk about international events through the prism of our culture wars, thereby making them feel unreal. This is an ultimately real event. Right? This is ultimately real for Syrians, driven by ultimately real political forces, social forces inside Syria, and by global forces. So don't allow yourself to participate in the Disneyfication of this, right? Through entering the conversation via culture war gambits. And I think there is another minor danger here, and that is that you're getting a heck of a lot of geopolitical analysis that sometimes comes without deep inside knowledge of the country, right? Which is why I am speaking to you as a minor public intellectual and not a country analyst, right? There's a lot of broad brushstroke political analysis going on here that's missing a real understanding of the interior dynamics in the country. Keep that in mind. Let's talk about the Russians. A lot of you are celebrating this through the prism of this being a blow for the Russians. And you're doing this in two ways. The first is that this is genuinely a geopolitical blow for Russia. What I would say is that it is a strategic and a geopolitical blow for Russia, but not a huge one. Let me just say one thing about it. For more, I can just direct you to Mark Galeotti's latest podcast. When the Russians got into Syria, as far as their regime stability was concerned, what was important to them is to keep Syria discourse in the country at the level that informational autocracies keep discourse about war. In other words, you're talking about the Russian involvement there, if you're the Kremlin, as though it's something that can be reshaped or taken out of the informational environment at any moment. That's why the Putin regime had to adjust so much when it began to fail in Ukraine in February 2022, because the regime wasn't prepared for a war that you couldn't just remove or manipulate in the informational environment any way you like. Syria was always removable in that way, always shapeable in that way, always peripheral in that way, and therefore at the level of public residence in Russia, it was always a minor issue. Here is the second question. Surely Putin can fall like Assad fell. It isn't as good and it's not going to happen. And isn't he weak? Well, for Putin to fall, what you need is a situation where enough people in Russia perceive that there is an actionable alternative. And that requires several things. First, it requires a crack in the regime. Second, it requires some kind of coherent alternative proposal. And third, it requires mobilization by some kind of political leader around that proposal. So if you ask me, is Putin weak or is Putin strong? Putin is weak if these things are in place. And you saw that from the Prigozhin rebellion, right? That people in Moscow felt that if this stuff carries on, nobody's going to stop it. But he is strong until these factors are in place, and none of them are in place. So that's how to understand Putin's weakness or strength under certain conditions. Were they to obtain, it would be almost sort of surreal how weak Putin would be, right? But until they maintain, until they obtain, it is not a situation where that regime is remotely movable. History. Now, together with the celebration, you've got to put on the table the idea that Syrian history, and I haven't been to Syria, but lots of people in my life spend a lot of time there journalistically. Well, one close person to me spent a lot of time there. And Syrian history and history generally tell us to be worried when we're talking about such a fractious, fraught mosaic of a country. And we have the worries of Libya, we have the worries of Iraq. The West learned a terrible lesson in Iraq, that once the regime collapses, the state may well collapse entirely. So history tells us to be pessimistic and concerned here, I'm afraid. And then the more immediate questions for us about the conduct of Al-Jilani might be, how is he going to be able to control his own fighters? How is he going to be able to interact and control, all the other rebel groups involved in this with their own quests for land, their own quests for power? We'll talk about this more soon. Lots of love.